Well, it's an honor to be here tonight. It's been a long evening, and it reminds me of a story that Bob Strauss told me when we were having martinis in Moscow when he was the ambassador. He talked about a dinner where there had been a lot of wine and a lot of cocktails before the dinner, and they knew they were going to have a long-winded speaker. And the speaker got up, and he was seated at one of these, he was standing at one of these table podiums. And he began droning on, and a fella next to him, who was clearly quite drunk, finally got impatient and swung an empty wine bottle at the speaker and missed. And hit the chairman of the event, who was sitting on the other side, who fell to the floor, bleeding profusely. And the guy who had swung the bottle got down on his hands and knees and was apologizing, and the speaker, the chairman of the event, said, "Well, just hit me again, because I can still hear the son of a bitch." So I will keep my remarks appropriately brief. And in particular, because I have to appear early in the morning with Secretary Clinton before the Senate Appropriations Committee. A fate worse than death. And particularly given the announcement that I made a few weeks ago about where we're headed with the defense budget. But it is certainly interesting and humbling to look around and be in front of so many of my former bosses. Spig Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft, and of course, President Bush. A reminder, if nothing else, of what it is always like to be staff. Of course, I joined the NSC in 1974, and by that time, Henry Kissinger was already in heaven and unapproachable by ordinary mortals. But I would tell you that, all that said, one of the great things of my life has been the amazing experience to work for two incredibly amazing American patriots, Spig Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. I have many stories about both of them, but I expect to be paid for them. Whenever the subject of President Bush comes up, beyond his many historic accomplishments in the national security arena, I always come back to his extraordinary decency, his integrity, and his remarkable sense of humor. One of the great privileges of my life was to be at President Bush's side as he provided inspired leadership to a world that in a span of less than 36 months experienced the liberation of Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany into NATO, the victory of the West in the Cold War, the first Gulf War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember vividly being with him at the State House in Helena, Montana. And a reporter asked him the question. He was doing a press conference in the State House. And a reporter asked him, "Well, what do you think about German reunification?" And he said, "Well, I think Germany has changed over the last 40 years. And if the Germans want to be united, I'm all for it. So I called General Scowcroft and I said, do we have a policy on German reunification? And Brent said, no, we're kind of working that through the interagency. I said, well, you got a policy now. And I remember being the note taker when President Bush spoke on the phone about these matters with Chancellor Kohl. It was the afternoon of November 10th, 1989, Washington time, the day after the Berlin Wall came down, and thousands of East Germans had already begun moving freely across the border. Chancellor Kohl told President Bush that it was like witnessing an enormous fair with the atmosphere of a festival. Reflecting on that period, I later wrote, "The imagination reels at the thought of a less experienced and skilled president trying to exploit the liberation of Eastern Europe or dealing with the final crisis and death throes of the Russian and Soviet Empire. As the communist bloc was disintegrating, it was George Bush's skilled yet quiet statecraft that made a revolutionary time seem much less dangerous than it actually was." As Commander-in-Chief, President Bush made life and death decisions about war and peace. He cared deeply about troops charged with carrying out his orders, something that I appreciate all the more in my current post. He once said that a peaceful, prosperous international order required the leadership, the power, and yes, the conscience of the United States of America. And that is as true as ever. The truth is, I love this man. I went to Texas A&M for him. I would walk through fire for him. I would even come to a Washington, D.C. dinner for him. Because I believe he is one of the greatest American patriots of all time. For his extraordinary leadership and many contributions to the well-being of his country, Europe, and the world, I am pleased to present the Atlantic Council's Award for Distinguished International Leadership to President George H.W. Bush, 41st President of the United States.